Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Lake County Master Gardeners February education event. We are very excited and very pleased to have Dr. Doug Tallamy with us tonight. He is reporting in from Delaware, and he is going to talk to us about the next steps for nature, questions and answers for how to save nature in our yards. So I'm going to first introduce myself and the Master Gardeners a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tallamy, and then I will come back at the end when we are getting ready to do questions.
Trigger the 2022 Highland Park mass shooting. 7 people were killed.
All right. If you have not muted yourself yet, mute yourself. You cannot be on microphone during our lecture. We are recording this. All right. The Lake County Master Gardeners have been a Master Gardener group since 1979. We are a group of a few hundred. Over all of time, I think we're somewhere around 500, but for now we're somewhere around 250 active Master Gardeners working in the community in Lake County, Indiana, helping others grow. We have upcoming education events. We have March 19th, The Art of Growing Food with Ellen Ecker-Ogden. That's a webinar. April 15th, Growing Vegetables in Small Spaces with C.L. Forneri. That's a webinar. May 8th is going to be in person at the County Extension Office in Crown Point, and that is the night shift, Moon Gardens and Nocturnal Pollinators.
Making jury instructions.
Who is one of our Master Gardeners. And June 12th is Disease Prevention and Diagnosis with Nikki Wikowski, who is one of the other extension educators in the area. If you are interested in learning more, or if you have not gotten onto our Lake County Master Gardener email account, email chain, then you can visit us at lakecountymastergardener.org. And you can sign up there. You can see our quarterly newsletter, and you can get a lot more information about our organization and what we do. Just so you know, today's webinar is being recorded. It will be shared. You are required to be muted and your video to be turned off during this lecture, and submit your questions in the Q&A section, not in the chat. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, and if you click on more, the 3 dots that say more, the Q&A is in there. I have the Q&A open already. So make sure that your questions go into the Q&A section, and we will review how to do that at the end again. So I have the great pleasure to introduce one of my heroes in the ecology world. Dr. Doug Tallamy is an entomologist. He's an ecologist and a conservationist. He is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has taught for over 4 decades. Dr. Tallamy is renowned for his research on the intricate relationships between plants and insects and the profound impact these interactions have on the diversity of animal communities. His work emphasizes the crucial role of native plants in supporting insect life and consequently the entire food web, including birds and other wildlife. And if you have ever been to one of my education seminars, a lot of my education seminars emulate Dr. Tallamy's message that we need native plants in the world in order to benefit wildlife all over. And so right now I would like to introduce Dr. Tallamy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dolly. All right, well, welcome everybody. This talk is essentially a talk about my new book coming out in April. The title that I submitted to Timber Press was Next Steps for Nature, Saving Nature with Your Yard. They didn't like that title. So they changed it to How Can I Help? saving nature with your yard. So if you're actually looking for this book, you better look under How Can I Help? Okay, I'll just remind you that we are evolutionary guests on this planet, and our stay here is provisional. It depends on how we treat our surroundings. If we destroy our life support systems, our residency on the planet is going to be a short one. And because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem, every person bears the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems. And fortunately, more and more people are accepting this responsibility, but they need more knowledge to act on it. And, you know, I have written books and I have given lots of talks, and people have read the books and heard the talks, but they still have very good questions, which they typically send me on email. So I decided to compile them and put them into the book called How Can I Help? And I think it's coming out April 9th. So we'll just go through a number. There's actually 499 questions that are answered in that book. We're not going to do 499 tonight, but we'll start. We'll see how far we get. Question one, this is one I get all the time. What got me interested in conservation? Well, it actually happened early on, third grade. I was in third grade, and we had just moved to a new suburban neighborhood in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. Our house was the first house to be built on a circle, and they built the houses from right to left. So the lot to the left of us was undeveloped for a full year after we moved in, and there was a little pond on that lot, looked just like this. And I used to go to that pond every day and see what was happening, particularly in the spring. It was a lot of fun. Toads came and they started to sing. Now, this was my first close interaction with nature. I'd never seen any of this before. The singers invited bigger toads and gave them a hug, and I thought that was really nice. They kept hugging them until eggs came, and of course, this is the male hugging the female, external fertilization. He's fertilizing these eggs as they come out, and then the pollywogs hatch. So I was there every day watching the development. First the hind legs would pop out, then the forelegs popped out as well, and then the tail started to shrink. And when they're ready to hop out, that's what they look like, little teeny toads, and they are teeny. And I wanted to be there the day that these guys marched out onto the land. And I was hunkered down next to the pond, but that was the day the bulldozer came and buried the whole pond. All the toads. I don't think the bulldozer guy saw me. I ran away. But it impressed upon me that we needed to save nature before people destroyed it. That was the accepted wisdom of the day, and it's been the accepted wisdom for a long time, but it's no longer adequate. We have to move beyond conservation into restoration, because conservation is not enough anymore. We've got to put it back together again. And besides, very few of us have the opportunity to save pristine habitat. It's mostly gone where we live, but we can help restore it wherever we are. What interests me now is that looking back on that experience, I could have walked right across to my own yard and dug another pond. I bet my parents would have helped me, but it didn't occur to me. Very big lost opportunity. Okay, question two, why can't insects adapt quickly to non-native plants? This is a good question. People rightly point out that insects adapt very quickly to insecticide pressure. They generate or they evolve insecticide resistance. And this is how that happens. You have a population of insects. A few of them are already resistant to the pesticide. So when it's sprayed, it kills everybody else, but not the few that are resistant. So they're the ones that are left, they mate, and the next generation has a lot more resistant ones. Then finally more, and finally everybody is resistant. Now notice, there was no adaptation necessary for that population to become resistant to an insecticide. It simply eliminated the ones that weren't resistant, and that can happen very quickly. In comparison, though, a lot of things have to change in order for an insect to adopt a new host plant. For example, a non-native that has been introduced. Let's go through those steps. You're talking about let's say it's a moth or a butterfly is trying to find a host plant in a sea of other plants, a matrix of other plants. They've got to pick out the right one. And they do that with their antennae. There are hundreds of little sensors on the antennae, and they actually smell the plant flying around. And when they think they've got the right plant, they land on it. So in order to adopt a new host plant, the first thing that has to happen is a mutation in the genes controlling antennal receptors. Now they've landed on the plant, and what they're doing is tasting the plant with more receptors on their feet, on their tarsi. So you would also need simultaneous mutations in the sensors on the tarsi as well. Then finally, before they actually lay an egg on the plant, they have more sensors on the tip of their ovipositor to make sure that they are in the right place. So you would again need mutations on those sensors as well. Then the egg is laid. This is a red spotted purple egg laid right at the tip of a black cherry leaf. That's where you would find them. Then the caterpillar hatches. The first thing it does is eat its eggshell because protein is in very short supply. But the next thing it does is have to start to eat the leaf on which its egg was laid. So it has to accept this plant as a new host plant. So if it's a non-native plant, he's got to say, okay, this is right. So there's got to be adaptations there, and he's got to have the physiological mechanisms to break down the toxins that are in that new plant. So lots of things have to happen for host switching to occur. You've got to find that new host and recognize it among all the other plants. The chemical signals that plant is giving off have to be accepted by the tarsi and the ovipositor. That's going to require mutations in those sensors. The larva has to have new taste sensors, and it's got to have new physiology to detoxify that plant. So host switches do happen, but not very often. They are rare indeed. Let's look at the monarch butterfly in its relationship with black swallowwort. Black swallowwort is in the milkweed lineage, so it has some of the attributes of milkweed. As a matter of fact, it smells like milkweed and has surface leaf waxes that are like milkweeds. So it tricks monarchs into recognizing it incorrectly as a host plant, landing on it, saying, okay, this is right, and then they actually lay their eggs on it. But when the eggs hatch, the larvae can't eat black swallowwort. They die. So after 170 years of this opportunity, the monarch still has been unable to adapt to using black swallowwort as a host plant. That's how hard it is for host switching to happen. Okay, question 3, you claim that it takes thousands of years, if ever, for insects to adapt to new host plants. That's that host switching I just talked about. But some other entomologists disagree and point to several species of butterflies that now breed successfully on non-native plants. How do you explain that? It's another good question. Well, there are actually 2 ways that insects adopt a new plant. I should say adopt, not adapt. Host switching, that's what I just described, very hard, and host range expansion, not very hard at all. So when I say it takes eons for an insect to adapt to a new host, I am talking about host switching. Host range expansion is something entirely different. And most of the examples of insects using non-native plants are examples of host range expansion, not host switching. So unlike host switching, where you need a lot of new adaptations, host range expansion does not require any new adaptations. The insect is already adapted to eating that particular plant. Let's use the black swallowtail as an example. It, of course, is a specialist on plants in the carrot family, and it can eat just about any of the plants in the carrot family. So when we imported Queen Anne's lace and real carrots and dill and parsley, the black swallowtail already had the ability to eat those plants. So no adaptations were necessary, and it started using them right away. And that is the case for just about all of the host adoption of non-native plants that we see out there. But even though you have host range expansion, if you look at the total Lepidoptera using native and non-native plants, or you can look at just the native leps. So the purple bar versus the purple bar over here. There's a 90% reduction in the use of non-native plants, which means, we've lost an awful lot of the species out there that are unable to use those non-native plants. Okay, what is the difference between a food web and a food chain? I always talk about food webs, but you hear the word food chain or the phrase food chain a lot. Well, here's an example. Columbine supports aphids. There they are on Columbine. Snake flies, that's an insect in the West, eat aphids. Lazuli buntings, a bird in the West, eat snake flies. And pygmy owls eat lazuli buntings. So that's it looks like a very simple linear chain. But dozens of species eat aphids. and dozens more eat snake flies, and many hawks and falcons eat birds like the lazuli bunting. So rather than it have be a linear chain between just a few organisms, it's more like a spider web. Everything's eating everything else, all starting with aphids. So there are food chains out there, but almost everything is really a food web, much more complicated than just a few individuals. There you go. Just a very simple diagram of what a food web looks like. It is not linear. Okay, I live in an area with lots of Lyme disease. Several websites suggest keeping large lawns because they're not attractive to ticks. The sites also say I should get rid of brush piles because ticks love them. How can I contribute to local ecosystems without getting Lyme disease? Well, let's think about what deer ticks need to survive in our landscapes. Deer ticks do not eat native plants. They do not eat leaf litter. They do not eat brush piles. They eat blood. So that's what they really need. And we have Lyme disease because we have too many deer. When I grew up, there was no Lyme disease, there were no deer ticks, and there were very few deer. I found a footprint in my front yard once, and it was so rare, I made a plaster cast of it, and it sat on my bookshelf as I was growing up. Never did see the deer that made it. Now, of course, we've got deer everywhere, and that has caused the explosion of deer tick populations and the emergence of Lyme disease. In a very simple system, three things are required. White-footed mice, they're a carrier of Lyme disease, and the ticks mate on deer. And then when you interject humans into this, ticks often take they're infected, and they bite us as well, and then we get Lyme disease. But a good way to reduce infectivity rates is to increase the number of dead-end hosts in your landscape. This is research that's come out of the Carey Institute in New York. So when you add things like skunks and chipmunks and possums and squirrels and bunnies and raccoons, groundhogs, foxes, these are not great hosts for Lyme disease, and it diffuses the infectivity that is in your yard. So if you get bitten by a tick, chances are good that it's actually not carrying Lyme disease. That's one way to reduce infectivity rates. And there's a great example in the South. There are a lot of deer in the South, and there are a lot of deer ticks, but very little Lyme disease. Why is that? Because the South has lizards that we don't really have. They've got anoles, they've got a couple species of skinks. They are dead-end hosts. So these guys siphon off the ticks bite them, and that is the end of the Borrelia. The disease cycle stops there. But okay, we don't live in the South, and we do have Lyme disease up here. How can we minimize our exposure in today's world without getting rid of all those deer? Think about how ticks attach onto you. They don't run after you. They crawl up on vegetation, put out their little legs, and they quest. And if you walk by, they grab onto you. So this type of landscape is a real good way to minimize your exposure to Lyme disease, particularly in May and June, which is when infectivity rates are the highest. Instead of a wall-to-wall carpeting of grass, you've got just a swath of grass. Now, it's true, ticks don't like grass. They like higher vegetation. So stick to areas like this, and they won't be able to grab onto you, and you won't get Lyme disease. But look at the other benefits you get from a landscape like this. This minimizes the amount of lawn that you have, so it's shrinking the lawn. It's managing the watershed with all these other plants much better than a vast lawn does. It's sequestering carbon, so it's helping climate change. It's helping pollinators with the plants that are here. It's supporting a viable food web, and it's favoring native plants. So you get all of that while you're trying to reduce Lyme disease. Okay, plants and animals have always moved around the planet. So the arrival of new species at our shores is a natural process. So what's the big deal? If the new species are more fit than the species already here, then they deserve to replace them. I get this question a fair amount, and there's some logic to it, but let's look at what the big deal is. There are actually two questions here. What's the big deal about new species, and are new species more fit? Well, the big deal is the rate at which these species are coming to our shores. Over time, they always have, but it was a rate at it was measured in thousands of years per species. It did not happen often. And it happened slowly enough that the native species could adapt to this infusion of new species. because they weren't coming in very fast. Now we are bringing in thousands. And just, in almost an ecological instant. And it overwhelms the ability of our native populations to adapt to them. Are new species more fit though? This is the interesting part of this question to me, because it does seem that when we bring in a new species, it takes over, and it seems like it's just much better fit for our native areas than our native species. Is that true? No, no, 1,000 times no. It's not true, and this is why it's not true. These species come over here. Let's just talk about introduced plants. They come over here without their natural enemies. Nothing is hindering their growth. They don't have their diseases. They don't have the natural herbivores. So they're at a competitive advantage over our native plants. And the thing that really puts them at a competitive advantage is those deer again, because deer eat a lot. We got a lot of deer. They don't like non-native plants, and they do like native plants. So every little native that pops up, the deer eat, particularly when you've got an overabundance of deer. And they leave the buckthorn, they leave the autumn olive, they leave the burning bush, they leave the Callery pear, they leave the porcelain berry, they leave all those guys, and of course that's all you have left. So it's really the overabundance of deer that is pushing these non-natives, giving them a competitive advantage over our native plants. When you fence out deer and leave them for several years, our native plants are quite competitive. They can compete very well with these non-natives. This is what a healthy understory looks like. This is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I visited there 2 springs ago again, and the first thing I saw was this wonderful understory. I hadn't seen that in a long time. And I asked the ranger next to me, how do you control your deer? And he said, we don't control our deer. I said, well, how come you got an understory? And he said, well, we've got black bears, we've got bobcats, and we've got coyotes, and we don't shoot them. And that is enough to keep the deer in check. Wolves are the primary deer predator, and they don't have any wolves, but it's still enough to keep the deer in check so that you have a healthy understory. This is what understories look like around my house. This is Japanese stiltgrass. The deer don't touch that. All the shrubbery is gone, including the spice bush, which deer don't like. You essentially don't have a functional forest. There's no recruitment into the forest anymore because of overabundance of deer. Okay, what about the risks of bringing nature into our everyday spaces? Isn't interacting with nature dangerous? Well, it used to be. In the old days, lions were a problem. We could get trampled by water buffalo. Crocodiles would eat us. Hyenas were after us. It was dangerous. But it's been a long time since I saw a lion or a water buffalo or a crocodile or a hyena in my yard. Our ability to assess risk is poor. Let's look at what is really killing us out there. We worry about snake bites. Well, on average, 2 people die a year from snake bites, and often these are avoidable accidents. The guy playing with the snake in the church basement, and so not very many. West Nile virus kills on average about 130 people a year. But what's really killing us? Alcohol, 75,000 deaths a year. Melanoma from sunbathing, about 8,000 deaths a year, with 76,000 new cases every year. Car crashes, 44,000. Child overheating, tragically, in our cars, over 500 deaths a year. Dogs, our best friend, are killing 20 to 30 of us a year. Falling, 20,000. Overdoses, the big one, almost 110,000 deaths a year. Texting, 3,228 deaths in 2013. Autoerotic asphyxiation, whatever that is, 600 deaths. Hot dogs are killing us. Lightning, 51 deaths. High school football, 20 deaths. Vending machines, we pull the vending machines over on us, 13 deaths. Toasters, we stick our forks in the toaster, 370 deaths a year. 41 deaths from flat screen TVs falling off the wall and hitting us. 379 deaths from selfies. So selfies are 13 times more deadly than venomous snakes. Driving is 1,600 times more deadly than venomous snakes. Can you guess how many people were killed by native plant gardening last year? Should we kill invasive species? Do we have the ethical right to decide whether a plant lives or dies? Another good question. It would be hard to find anybody who did not believe that humans are superior beings to all other beings on the planet. And if there is a conflict between humans and wildlife, then humans should win. But you know, that's exactly what lions think. It's what weevils think. It's what dung beetles think. It's what those rattlesnakes think. Everything thinks they are superior beings. Even people who question our inherent right to manage invasive species are making decisions about what lives and dies every single day. Every time you plant a non-native species that doesn't support bird food over a native plant, you're deciding whether or not the chickadee in your yard is going to be able to feed its babies, or whether they're going to watch them starve to death because they can't find enough caterpillars. When you maintain a lawn like this, you're deciding whether or not hundreds of species of native plants and thousands of animals that depend on those plants are going to thrive in this space. When we hire a mosquito fogger, we're sending not just mosquitoes, but monarchs, pollinators, caterpillars, all those things in our yard, every insect in our yard to death. And if we don't control invasives, we're gutting entire food webs. Do we have the right to do that? Question 9, why do you only focus on moths? Aren't butterflies important too? Well, ecologically, no, they're not nearly as important. Butterflies are just bad tasting day flying moths. And I say that because here's the phylogeny of moths, and here are the butterflies coming out right in the middle of them. They don't taste good, which is why they can fly during the day without being eaten. And the reason I say that moths are more ecologically important, first, there's a lot more of them. For every species of butterfly, there are 19 species of moths. But this is the important thing of moths and their caterpillar. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. Dan Jansen calls them the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. We essentially can't do without them. And besides, moths are really cool. Some of them look like rhinoceroses, or they look like fish, and that is not photoshopped. They look like algae. They look like spaceships. They look like stealth bombers. A lot of them look like lichens, including this guy here. A lot of them look like bird dung. Nobody wants to eat a bird do. Some of them will silk the flower petals of the flower that they're eating on their back so they look just like it. That's really cool. Some of them just look exactly like the conifer needles that they're eating. That's a caterpillar there. That's a caterpillar there. Some of them curl up within the helianthus seed heads that they're eating. That's a caterpillar there. These are all very neat things. This is the greatest leaf mimic in the world, in my opinion. It's from Asia. The wings actually curl over, so they're looking exactly like leaves. Some of them look like seeds. Some of them look like seed pods. A lot of them look like sticks, both as caterpillars and as adults. Some of them look like jet planes. Some of them look like clowns. Don't ask me why. Some of them have lightning logos on their wings. Some of them are huge, and some of them are really tiny. That's a pinhead. That's the size of that moth. Some of them are inherently beautiful, both as adults and as caterpillars, and some of them are not. Some of them have a startle effect that can actually scare us. Some of them have two heads. Nah, not really. This is a mating pair. It just looks like it has two heads. Some of them look a lot like snakes. This is actually a sphinx moth found in the tropics. Many of them are mimicking things that hurt us, like yellow jackets. That's actually a moth. Some of them mimic beetles. Some of them look like jewels. And some of them look like that. So they're just really cool. Okay, do honeybees compete with native bees? This is a good question with an unpopular answer. Honeybees are extreme generalists. A single honeybee hive can house up to 30,000 bees, and they can forage up to 2 miles from their hive. So a single hive can potentially compete with native bees over 8,000 acres of land. Beekeepers supplement their hives with sugar. So the hives never get depressed when forage is low. There's always a lot of bees out there. So even when there's not a lot of flower density out there, we've got a lot of honeybees. As of April 2022, there were 2.92 million hives in the US, which means honeybees have saturated the entire continental US 11.5 times. Now, let's assume that native bee populations are near their carrying capacity. There are as many native bees out there as there are flowers that can support them. Then on top of that, you add 30,000 bees per hive to an area that's already saturated with native bees. You can't do that without degrading the resources of those bees. Another bee-related question. Privet flowers are good sources of honey and pollen for honeybees. If we remove privet from our natural areas as part of our fight against invasive species, won't our honeybees suffer? Well, there are actually 9 species of privet that are highly invasive in the US. That's me, so they get big. In Alabama alone, plants like this cover 1 million acres. So it's a serious invasive all over the east, but particularly bad in the south. Now, privet blooms for about a week, and there are honeybees around during that week, and it helps them. But what are they going to do the other 51 weeks of the year when they're not in bloom? This is what it looks like the rest of the time. It's taking up space. It's excluding any native blooming plants. So it's actually creating a forage desert for any of our native bees or the honeybees. And that's what you're looking at when you have millions of acres of privet. You have lost forage opportunities. Oaks are dying right and left. As we cut them down, should we leave the logs or have them hauled away in order to get rid of the disease? That's another good question. So we do have several oak diseases. We've got oak leaf scorch, bacterial leaf scorch. This is a red oak that has died on my property from that. But the disease spores are spread when the oak is still alive, when you have living material. After it's dead, the disease spores are not in the remaining wood. So keeping dead wood around has a lot of advantages, a lot of ecological advantages because of the number of species that depend on dead wood. Many of them are small, like little columbullans, but you've got dozens of species and millions of individuals in those logs. You've got centipedes to eat them and millipedes eating the fungus. You've got click beetles, that's where they breed in down wood. Fired color beetles, a lot of beetles are breeding in wood. Many species of scarab beetles develop as larvae in downed wood. Cerambycid longhorn beetles develop as flat-headed borers in wood. If you split wood, you often run into these guys. Leucanid stag beetles develop in logs. Basalid best beetles have entire colonies within down logs. Buprestid metallic wood-boring beetles live in logs. There's several species of butterflies that spend the winter as adults in down logs and little cracks and crevices, things like the mourning cloak and commas and question marks. And then, of course, you've got those carpenter bees. They are in our house because we have removed all of their nesting sites in our yards. They used to nest in downed wood. And we've got carpenter ants. Carpenter ants are living in that wood. They don't eat wood, but they're living in that. And that's good news for the pileated woodpecker because that is what pileated woodpeckers rear their young on. If you lose your carpenter ants, which you would if you got rid of all your down wood, then you lose your pileated woodpeckers. Question 13, what is the best way to plant and propagate milkweed? We all want to plant milkweed. We want to help the monarchs, but seeds are the hardest way to do that. First of all, there's a lot of inviability in milkweed seeds out there. And if it is viable, they germinate and then they're tiny little things. You got to nurse them along until they get big enough to withstand environmental stresses. The easiest way to start new milkweeds is to dig up an existing milkweed, and you'll find that it's attached underground by a stolon, and you have these ramets that grow up from that stolon. So what you do is you dig it up and then cut it off maybe at 2-3 inch lengths like this, put it under the soil about an inch, and that same season you'll get a strong milkweed plant quite quickly. If we're talking about monarchs, is rearing monarchs good or bad? Well, it depends on your intentions. People typically rear monarchs for 2 reasons, for fun and educational purposes or for conservation. There are a lot of pluses rearing monarchs and other butterflies for educational purposes, particularly for our young, actually our adults too. We need a lot of education. You learn about the different life stages, the egg, the larva, the pupa, and the adult. That's complete metamorphosis. You learn about host plant specialization. Without ever saying the words, people get it that if you don't have milkweeds, you don't have monarchs. That is host plant specialization. If you're rearing them for conservation, you have to rear a lot of them, which typically means you're crowding them, which is a perfect recipe for spreading diseases. Even if they don't show symptoms, they could pick up spores of diseases. You're also removing those monarchs from natural selection that occurs outdoors. And then you're releasing them. You're releasing genetic stocks that have not gone through the selection process. The best way to help monarchs, for all those people who are concerned about monarchs, rather than rearing them indoors, is to plant more milkweed. If you have a big milkweed patch like this, there'd be plenty of milkweed for all your monarchs. They can rear themselves. They'll be exposed to natural selection, and you are helping their conservation. The monarchs on my milkweeds keep disappearing. Just when they get big, they disappear. I assume birds are eating them, but I thought monarch caterpillars tasted bad, so I'm confused. What is stealing my monarchs? Nothing is stealing your monarchs or any of your other butterflies that just disappear. I hear this a lot with black swallowtails too. They disappear just before they finish growing. And what they've really done is crawl off the host plant to form their chrysalis someplace else. Butterflies don't want to make a chrysalis on the host plant because natural enemies seek out the host plant to find the caterpillar or the chrysalid. So the butterfly wants to get as far away from the host plant as possible. So here's a monarch chrysalis in my backyard. It's spun on a grass leaf. Here's a pipevine swallowtail chrysalis in my backyard. It's spun on another grass leaf. Some of these guys will crawl, 25, 30 yards away from their host plant and then form their chrysalis. So nothing is taking your monarchs or your other butterflies. They're simply forming their chrysalis someplace where you are not looking. Okay, question 15. I recently came across an Asian lady beetle in my backyard. I can't seem to find any definitive answer as to whether they are harmful to the local ecology or not. Well, Asian lady beetles were introduced in the 1960s before there were rigorous rules about introducing predators. And they were introduced to fight ag pests, particularly aphids. And they're really good at it. They eat a lot of aphids. Now, they come in lots of forms. What's consistent, not 100%, but most of the time, they have this inverted W or M on their prothorax. But the number of spots, the color, all of that varies quite a bit. These are native lady beetles, and unfortunately, the Asian lady beetles have displaced these native species pretty much every place they've gone. Several of these are in big trouble now. So in terms of ladybird beetle diversity, the Asian lady beetle has not been good, and you can do what you think you must do to help that out. Okay, question 16. What are those orange and black bugs on my milkweed? Should I kill them? Why is our default always to kill something we don't know about? We're a nasty species. There's several black and orange things on your milkweed. You're probably talking about the large milkweed bug, Onchopeltis fasciatus, shows up in midsummer, early August, and starts to reproduce. It is in the family Lygeidae, and it eats milkweed seeds. The seeds, of course, are in the pod. Now, these guys have sucking mouth parts. How do you suck up a solid seed through the pod coating here? What's it called? We'll just call it the pod. Well, you do that by external digestion. And the nymphs do it as well. That means that they are spitting digestive enzymes onto the seed pods, digesting them externally, and then sucking them up. So when you have a whole bunch feeding gregariously like this, they're dissolving a lot of seeds under there, and it's easier to suck it up. It also provides a very strong aposematic signal. When you taste bad, you want to be orange and black because that tells predators that you taste bad. When there's a lot of you together, it's a much bigger signal. But the aggregation is probably more about feeding facilitation than anything else. And people get upset that they're going to kill your milkweed plant or they're going to eat all the milkweed seeds. They're not going to do either one. If you have milkweeds without these guys, there's a problem. These are the normal types of species that are associated with your milkweed. Milkweed seeds are layered in these pods, and these guys can only reach the first layer. So there's still plenty of seeds that are viable in a pod, even if you have milkweed bugs. And you'll probably notice that mid-September, late September, they all disappear. And what they do is they migrate. They migrate just like the monarch all the way south to the Gulf states that continue to have milkweed pods available for them to eat all winter long. So it's a little bug, but it has a long migration. Another orange and black creature on your milkweed is the milkweed tussock moth. As later instars, they're orange and black. Earlier instars, they're not. But they feed gregariously. It helps them get around the sticky latex sap that glues their mouth parts shut. But they can eat an entire milkweed ramet. And again, people get upset. But it's just like mowing your milkweed. It comes right back. And they're pretty as caterpillars. They're not so pretty as adults. Again, you can have the milkweed bugs. You can have the milkweed tussock moth without any problem if you have a large milkweed patch. So the more milkweed, the better. Could you provide your thoughts on the use of southern, more heat-tolerant species within more northern parts of the U.S.? Sure. This is called assisted migration, and I'm not a fan, and this is why. So in the old days, before climate change, we have the jet stream going across the U.S. like this, and it would wobble a little bit, but not that much. And generally above the jet stream, it was quite cold. Below the jet stream, it was much more moderate. Today, we've got increased climate variability. The jet stream is going crazy, and we've seen it a lot this winter. It wasn't long ago, I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They had just had 9 inches of snow, and it got down to 9 degrees. And that happens when the jet stream dips really far south. A couple of years ago, we had a freeze in Texas, actually all the way down in Mexico, that was so cold it even killed native plants. So this increased variability is what we're dealing with climate change. That also means it gets unusually warm when the jet stream goes up. But if we start moving plants from the south up, it's not a general, slow warming. It's this crazy variability, and these cold snaps will kill those plants. We'll also be moving plants away from the community of animals that they co-evolved with. Remember, one of the major functions of these plants is to provide food for adapted insects in particular. And if we move the plants away from those insect populations, depending on how far you move them, then the plant, it's just like a new non-native plant. It's escaped the things that typically eat it, and it's no longer contributing to its local ecosystem. So I think, I don't know, it's controversial. A lot of people disagree with me, but I would rather leave the plants where they are and hope we have enough genetic variability so they can adapt to the crazy swings in weather that we're throwing at them. What do you think of no mow May? I think it's good intention, but it's a bad idea. It doesn't make any ecological sense, and this is why. Grass is a very poor plant for pollinators, and if you don't mow it, it goes from short to tall, but it's not helping the pollinators at all. If you have the lawn the way you're supposed to. This is a house that went through foreclosure near me, so they simply stopped mowing the lawn, and that's what it looks like. It'd be much better. Well, let's return to this. Let's say that you do this in May. And let's say you've got a bad lawn. So you've got dandelions and dead nettle and a few other blooming things, and it's actually supporting a few pollinators. And then in June, you mow it all and pull the rug out from underneath those pollinator populations that have gotten started. Pollinators need forage not just in May. They need forage all season long, typically from April all the way into early November, believe it or not. So what is a much better plan, instead of having no mow May, have no mow areas that you don't mow anytime. We call them pollinator gardens. And you want to seek a sequence of pollinating plants in those gardens so that you have forage available for your pollinators all season long. How should I remove lawn? not going to spend a lot of time in this. There's several approaches. You've got to kill the root systems of your turf grass, and you can smother it with black plastic or cardboard or builder's paper. You can use herbicides. That's what the professionals do because they don't have months and months to wait. Those things work. What doesn't work is digging and flipping your grass sod because you haven't killed the roots and it'll keep growing, or cutting it really short and then seeding over it. That's going to waste a whole lot of seed because the grass is really competitive. So this is what it looks like when you cover it with black plastic. It's a lot of work. That's a lot of plastic. But if you do that for a couple of months, you actually can kill the grass. This is the cardboard approach. And I tried this once, but look, you can even see it here. Cardboard always has packing tape on it or address labels. And unless you spend a lot of time peeling that stuff off, you put it on there, then you put the mulch over top. And it works. It'll kill the grass for the most part, but you end up with plastic. I'm still pulling up packing labels from the garden where I did this once. So I wouldn't do it again. If I'm going to cover my lawn and try to kill it with something, I would use builder's paper. It's cheap. This is the stuff when you walk into a new building, it's on the floor so you don't scuff up the floor. You put mulch over top of it, and then you can plant right through it because it degrades very easily. Will smother your lawn, and it's great for putting plugs straight through. If you do want to spray, there's grass-specific herbicides that are designed to only kill grass. What do you think of Miyawaki forests? This was a method developed by a Japanese forester named Akira Miyawaki back in the 1970s, but it's really catching on now. And the idea here is to plant a small area really, really densely. And it's really designed, or his idea was to get greenery into urban spaces and to pack it in there so tightly that it minimizes competition with the plants you may not want. It can be a community building event where everybody gets together and they plant these things. So there are advantages and disadvantages to Miyawaki forests. The advantages are that plant costs are low because you're planting the plants small, really young. So you get them cheaply. Weeding is reduced because you plant them so closely together that it's hard for the weeds to get in there. You get high plant diversity, which in theory creates high insect diversity, which in theory builds up a robust food web. So this is the part that hasn't really been tested. And I actually have a grad student now who's started, and she's going to work on Miyawaki forests this summer and following summer to test this, to see how well Miyawaki forests are supporting insect populations. The disadvantage is that over time, those plants are going to compete with each other, and you will lose a lot of them and have a few winners. And in the early stages of this, this is what I focused on. I said, well, gee, why don't you just start with a few plants and you don't have to spend all that time with the other ones. But I've changed my mind on that. Planting the plants when they're small does reduce weeding, and it does get a lot of greenery into your space very quickly, and it minimizes maintenance. If you just plant, let's say you plant 3 or 4 trees in the same space, you have to maintain the area between those trees right from day one. So I now think that Miyawaki forests is probably a good idea. We need a little bit more research to be certain about that. Okay, question 20. I often find the expense of purchasing native plants is out of my budget. Do you have any suggestions? Yes, I do. Let nature plant your native plants. This is what Rick Dark calls addition by subtraction. All you do is remove the plants you don't want, and the seed bank and animals will bring in the plants that you do want. So this was a picture from my yard at one point. We didn't plant any of the asters, any of the andropogon. I planted the oak tree, come back here, and the Ilex verticillata, but everything else, the goldenrod, They all came in on their own. That's addition by subtraction. Who's doing the addition? Well, things like red squirrels and gray squirrels and chipmunks and blue jays and ants, believe it or not, are carrying around spring ephemeral seeds. This is an eliasome. It's a tasty little morsel on the seeds of, this happens to be bloodroot. But the ants love the eliasome. They will carry the seed back to their nest, eat the eliasome, and then throw the seed itself, which they can't eat, into their garbage dump, which is about an inch below the surface of the soil. Perfect place for these seeds to germinate. So the only thing you have to be mindful of is when those non-natives you don't want, this is burning bush, pop up. But it's easy. You get your little whacker, you can pull them out when they're small. It's only a problem when you let them get big. And in all of that time, you haven't spent any money at all. Okay, I've been told that all annuals are weeds. They have very little wildlife value, and you should always replace them with perennials. Is this true? Well, not in my world. I think the notion that annuals are just placeholders for more valuable perennials is preposterous, and things like the hummingbird would agree with me. Jewelweed is an annual, and hummingbirds depend on it every single year. There's lots of things that depend on annuals, like the painted chinnia depends on Indian blanket. I mean, I could go on for a long time here. Cuculio astratus depends on native asters, particularly horseweed. Don't do this to me. Why is that happening? I know why. How about that? Goldenrod stowaway, that's a misnomer. It depends on this plant, which is Biden's aristosa. Ditch daisy, and many other things depend on these things. The common spraguea, crazy name. It's a beautiful moth. It depends on ragweed, and so does the ragweed flower moth, and so do over 40 other species depend on ragweed. Now, we don't like ragweed, but if we change its name to ambrosia, which is the genus name, then it's okay. Okay. Do you have a succinct statement to submit to my HOA who recently cited me for growing weeds? I am full of statements. I don't know how distinct they are, but how about this? We humans face life-threatening crises from climate change and biodiversity loss. Reducing the area of lawn and using more productive native plants in our landscapes addresses both of these crises. This can be done tastefully, without the use of chemicals, and without reducing property values. It is the future of landscaping. Back to HOAs. My HOA believes native plantings are going to reduce property values. How can I convince them otherwise? Well, a little bit of education actually starting to work. The acceptability of a landscape depends on how it's maintained and designed, not on the species in that landscape. This is a very formal planting designed by Lynn O'Shaughnessy. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant, and I can't believe an HOA wouldn't accept that planting. This is a 100% non-native, ornamentally non-native yard here. It's got English ivy on the wall here. It's got non-native ornamentals or azaleas. This is Norway maple, pachysandra, but nobody's taking care of it. So an HOA might have a problem with this. It has nothing to do with the origin of the plants. This is Pam Carlson's yard. Pam might even be on this call. I don't know. Beautiful example of how to use native plants. No HOA would have a problem with this. It's a perfect example of how to use lawn as a cue for care. So really, it's about maintenance and design, not about the origin of the plants. I have a small property. Should I plant several individuals of a few species, or should I try to squeeze as much diversity onto the property as possible, but only have one or two individuals of each species? I get this question a lot, and it's a good one. And it kind of depends on what it is you're planting these species for. What are you managing? What is your conservation or your restoration all about? So if you're trying to restore monarch populations, planting one or two milkweed ramets is not good enough because they're likely to strip it and then not have enough to to eat. That would be a much better approach, but that's very low diversity. But remember, you're trying to help monarchs. They don't want diversity. If you are planting something for pollinators, massing the plant for your pollinators is a good idea because it minimizes the distance the pollinator has to move between flowers. So it saves them energy. A lot of these broad scale restorations are hard to do on a small property. So it's a very good time to get to know your neighbor and spread the restoration responsibilities out, because you can't get all these species onto your property. This is a new development. It's nothing but grass. What a wonderful opportunity for the neighbors to get together and say, gee, you plant the oak tree, I'll plant the pollinator garden, you put the black cherry in, and so on. And then you can have the amount of plant material you need to actually support a population and divide it out amongst the neighbors. Why do you want us to keep leaves on our property? Leaves do three important things. They protect the soil moisture, they return nutrients to the soil, and they provide a lot of habitat. There are more species that live in the soil than above the soil, and they all require high humidity. 250,000 mites per square meter of leaf litter, 100,000 springtails, that's a springtail, per square meter, 90,000 proturans, those are primitive insects, 1 million nematodes. These guys are all in a meter of leaf litter, and most of them are detritivores, breaking down that leaf litter so the nutrients your tree used the previous year will return to the soil so that it can use it in the future. There are a lot of creatures that depend on leaf litter too, like the beautiful banded hair streak. Its caterpillar develops on oak leaf litter. Looks just like that. There are 70 species of moths that are called litter moths, where the caterpillars eat the leaf litter. So things like the ambiguous litter moth, the American idea, the dark-spotted palthus, and 67 other species. When you rake away your leaves, you're raking away a lot of food that other things depend on, like all those predators that are after those caterpillars. Many species of ground beetles. How about your fireflies, your lightning bugs? These are actually beetles. That's what the adult looks like. There's the lantern. Well, the larvae are predators in leaf litter, where they're eating arthropods and slugs and snails. So if you rake away your leaf litter, you lose your fireflies. And of course, the birds know all of that, and they're hunting in your leaf litter all the time. Where should you put your leaves? Well, this is just a neighbor down the street. This is not an example of a bunch of native plants, but he does move the leaves off to his flower beds on the side. And of course, people, well, this was a homestay I did at some point, and they had a little rock division here, and they put all their leaves in this flower bed here. So it's just an example. But people worry, if I put my leaves in my flower beds, the plants won't be able to get through. Who was raking the leaves before we got here? That's all I can think of. And you know what? Nobody was raking the leaves, and there were plants in North America. I read that someplace. So here's trout lily coming through leaves that haven't been raked at all. This is wood poppies at my house coming through the leaves that I don't rake. Here they are a little bit later. They make it, no problem. Delicate little violets coming through without raking the leaves. So our plants are much better at getting through leaf litter than we give them credit for. Should I mulch my leaves? Should I run them through my lawnmower? You can, and I guess they're a little bit aesthetically more pleasing. They won't blow away as much, but you're also mulching all the things that live in those leaves. Those 70 species of litter moths. There is a dot line white caterpillar cocoon in this leaf litter, and you're never going to see it when you're raking it away. Where is it? It's right there. There it is, up a little closer. And this is what the dot line white looks like, a beautiful moth. So you're raking away a lot of the life when you do that. Do cultivars of native plants have the same ecological value as their parent species? This used to be the most common question I got, because when you go to the nursery to buy native plants, it's typically just cultivars available. So are they any good? The answer is it depends. It depends on what the genetic trait was that was selected to produce the cultivar. Now, many cultivars are just genetic variants that are found in nature. This is one of them. Phlox paniculata genna was found in Georgia. It has twice the number of flowers as the straight species. And guess what? It has twice the number of pollinators as well. But we did a study looking at 6 cultivar traits: enhanced fall coloration, leaf variegation. If you take a tall plant and make it short, introduce disease resistance, enhance fruiting, turn a green leaf into red or purple leaves. We did that in a common garden experiment for 3 years at Mount Cuba Center. And the only trait that discouraged insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. So that's one thing I could say without hesitating. Avoid red leaf cultivars if you really want to help the local food web. We didn't look at flowers, and of course, most of the cultivars do focus on flowers. When you make a double flower, you're taking the reproductive plant parts of the flower and turning them into petals. It's beautiful, but it renders the flower ecologically without value. It's also an ecological trap. So the pollinators will come here and waste energy not finding anything. It's a double flower bloodroot. All of most, the hydrangeas you buy in the nursery are typically double flowers too. But if you want the very latest on cultivar comparisons with straight species, go to Mount Cuba Center's website. There it is there. And they've got extensive trial gardening with cultivars of a lot of different species. And it's all up on their website. So you can get the very latest research. And it supports what I've said. It depends on what the cultivar trait is. Sometimes there's no problem at all. Does urban restoration work? Or are you encouraging ecological traps that will lure animals to their death? That is a really good question, and we need more research to look at this. But early results are very promising. Emily Geist in Omaha, Nebraska, did a study with monarchs, comparing monarch survivorship in wild populations of milkweeds with monarch survivorship in gardens and in city environments. And it turned out they did better in the gardens and in city environments. And my student years ago, Brian Cutting, did the same thing. He looked at milkweeds in the wild and milkweeds in people's gardens, and found out that monarchs had a much higher survivorship in the people's gardens. So that's encouraging. Look what we did with bluebirds by putting up artificial nest boxes. If we hadn't done that, we might have lost our bluebirds, because they were really headed down with the loss of cavities of our tree holes and the introduction of house sparrows and starlings. Bluebirds were in big troubles in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And then people started putting up bluebird houses in our human-dominated spaces, and now bluebirds are one of the most common species we have out there. There's a big study in Switzerland by Benedict Schmidt, who looked at amphibians in man-made ponds right in the middle of an urban center. And it was a big study. And he found out that amphibian populations increased, I think, at 10 species, all 10 species. No, there were 10 species he looked at. 8 of them increased dramatically in those ponds when the ponds were established. 2 of them did not change because because those species required larger ponds than the ones that were built. But even in the middle of the city with all the roads and everything else, frogs and salamanders were doing quite well. So we do need more research, but it's promising beginning. Okay, what gives you hope? How do you not become discouraged by the task at hand? Well, some days I do get discouraged, but most of the time not. And the reason I don't is that there are several very hopeful things happening now. First of all, there's global awareness about the different environmental crises that we have, including the biodiversity crisis. The UN has met twice to talk about the biodiversity crisis. They pass resolutions and we ignore them, but at least they're talking about it, and that's step one. But the public is starting to recognize that we as individuals are not powerless when it comes to conservation. We can shrink our lawn, and more people are doing that. We can use keystone plants, the plants that support the food web better than other plants. We can change our light bulbs from white bulbs to yellow bulbs, because we now know that yellow wavelengths don't attract nocturnal insects. And in so doing, we save millions of insects every night during the summer. We can stop employing mosquito foggers that do not control mosquitoes, but do kill monarchs and pollinators. We can put beds under our trees to create what Heather Holm calls soft landings. We're really talking about the places where caterpillars that developed in the trees drop to the ground, and then they can complete their pupation without being squashed by mowers or our feet. Or the big culprit here is compacted soil that don't allow them to get underground. We can put pollinator gardens into our yards, and we put a little fence around them so that they're socially acceptable. We can remove our invasive plants from our yards. Municipalities are helping by establishing cost-sharing programs that encourage people to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate plantings. This is a program in Minnesota that's been, it's one of the oldest ones going, but it's now happening in Pennsylvania, a new program starting in Virginia. So this is catching on. States are banning the sale of invasive plants, either wholesale or piecemeal, but it's starting to happen. HOAs are realizing that native landscaping is not going to lower property values. Illinois passed a rule saying HOAs are not allowed to do that anymore. And I think Florida has a similar rule. HOAs are not allowed to tell you can't use native plants. Our farming regions are starting to recognize that the loss of what they called weeds, our milkweed and our asters and our goldenrod and all the things that supported the monarch and all of our native bees from the edges of roadsides of agriculture, that was a terrible mistake. We replaced it with lawn that needed to be mowed. We could put it back, and that's starting to happen as well. The idea of prairie strips is just a wonderful idea. It's a win-win for everybody. You put these strips right through the corn and the soybeans. It's a wonderful habitat for pollinators, but it also intercepts nutrients and topsoil before they get into our watershed. But what's encouraged me more than anything else is the speed with which these changes are happening. I didn't think they'd ever happen, believe it or not, but they are happening, and they're happening really, really quickly. So that is truly encouraging. Robert Swan, not too long ago, said, "The greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it." Well, people are recognizing that they are nature's best hope. You are nature's best hope. Nobody else is going to do it. It's going to be us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tallamy. That was absolutely informative and delightful. Appreciate it very much. I am looking at the question and answer box, and I only see one question so far. So if you are on a computer, you can go down to the bottom of your screen, and there's a little box on the bottom that says question and answer. It says Q&A. It's got a little question mark on it. And one of our master gardeners says, "How do you recommend approaching towns to stop spraying for mosquitoes?" That is a really popular question for me at my lectures.
I think we could. This would be a whole lot easier if we could get mosquito companies to be honest in their advertising. They say we're spraying a organic, natural product, and it only kills mosquitoes. I mean, if that were true, I'd hire them, but it's not true. You had to point out that cyanide is a natural organic product, ricin's a natural organic product, and it kills all the insects it comes in contact with, and it doesn't control mosquitoes. That's the key. So none of it makes any sense. It's just that your township doesn't know that. Usually they start spraying because a few people complain. And if we made it clear that the mayor is not going to get reelected if he continues mosquito spraying, he would stop it, or she would stop it, because they do want to be reelected. So we, as the general public, have to make it known this is no longer acceptable.
Okay. Communication is the key, I think. One of our other participants says that Route 30, which is a really it's a large state highway it's a US highway that goes through Lake County. It's a highway by us. It's a 2-lane or 4-lane highway. It's all grass in between and on the sides. And the question is, how do I convince them to plant native plants that they do not have to mow or plant milkweed? How do we convince the counties to do that?
Well, it's the same thing, but they actually did a big study at the University of Delaware, $4 million study looking at public opinion of roadside plantings. And the big takeaway was that the public liked it as long as there was at least one mower's width of grass between the road and the planting. If the planting went right up to the road, I don't know, public was uneasy about it and they didn't like it. But one mower's width works. You have to convince the township that nobody's going to lose their job, that you can reduce mowing by attrition. When somebody retires, you just don't hire another one. But you have to remove the threat of people losing their jobs. And we have to be careful about what we're asking for. In a high-speed road, and that's usually a bigger road with a median, don't plant in the median. We did a study on that too. And of course, the monarch and the bumblebees and everything that goes to the median, they have to fly across high-speed traffic to get there, and they get clobbered. So it's a lot of potential habitat, but it's probably not the place to do this. The roadsides, that would be where we should focus. And the slower traffic roads along all the farmer lanes and everything, that's really where we want to focus because the traffic load is so light.
That's very interesting because I've had that question before too, and people are concerned about the insects getting hit by cars. So it's very interesting.
They do, yeah.
Our next question is from an anonymous participant, and they say, I have reduced my turf grass, planted native perennial trees, shrubs, etc., but I'm still getting harassed about my lilac bush and hostas. Any help or let me know if I'm an awful person to keep them? My opinion, if it matters, is no, because I have both of those plants at home, along with all my natives. Everybody here knows that I have natives out the wazoo. What do you think, Dr. Tallamy?
Well, I'll talk about another study we did with my former grad student Desiree Narango, where she wanted to know what percentage of natives was necessary to maintain a viable food web good enough to support chickadee populations. And this was in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest it's around 30%. So if you have 70% native plants, you can have up to 30% non-native without crashing the food web. So your hostas and your lilacs are not invasive species. They're decorations in your yard, and really, they're just fine as long as that's not all you have. So if you balance them with the things you mentioned, you get your oaks and other things in there, no problem at all. Just imagine that they're little statues, and actually they're better than statues because there are things that go to the flowers of those plants. Actually, when you let your hostas go and they bloom, hummingbirds use them all the time. So they're not total.
My bumblebees use my hostas for nectar.
Yeah.
So I was always fascinated about that.
So you're not a bad person. There is room for compromise.
There is. There is. Another question out there is, should we wash our plants that we get from the big garden stores? I think that this is probably
Yeah.
the invasive worm question. What's the worm called?
Oh, I thought this would be an insecticide question.
Well, that too probably, but there is the invasive worm
Oh, you're talking about the roots. Yeah.
that is eating the roots of everything in forests and gardens and things like that. And it is a concern that we might come across them from plants from garden stores.
Yeah, there are 3 species of invasive worms, and they overwinter as egg sacs in the soil. And they're tiny little things. You will never see them. So if you suspect that the soil around plants that you've gotten from any kind of a garden center has those eggs in them, yeah, washing all the soil off the roots and starting over again is recommended. You do not want those worms to be introduced to your property because once they're there, it is really tough. If you're talking about washing them to get rid of insecticide, that's not going to work because the insecticides in the plants are systemic. They are inside the plant, and it's neonicotinoids. So the best thing is to find a garden center that does not use neonicotinoids, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Right, exactly. Our next question is, how long do you recommend delaying garden cleanup in the spring?
Um, well, people think that after a certain number of degree days, then everything that's hiding in your garden will have emerged, and then you can go to town with the lawnmower or whatever you do. That's not the way it works. Species emerge according to a timetable that's species specific, and they'll emerge all the way across the entire summer. So that yellow moth I showed you, the goldenrod stowaway, that doesn't come out till the end of July. So if you said, well, I'm gonna clean up my garden in March or April, you still would have nailed that guy. Um, and that's true for an awful lot of species. So uh, we do have to clean up our gardens. There's no safe way to do it where nothing's going to get hurt. And that's all I can say.
I have just kind of stopped cleaning up. Some years I do cut down my stems and just put them in the garden, just lay them in the garden, cut them off at about, 10, 12 inches and just chop and
Yeah,
drop.
that's right. Cut
Um,
off that because those cut off stems, that's where the bees will nest the following summer.
Yeah, and so if that's true, then and we have so many species that are coming out later on in the summer, it really doesn't matter how far into spring you do or do not clean up. It's a matter of keeping the waste there in the garden, which will eventually break down and enrich the soil in your garden. So it's more of like an aesthetic thing. You kind of have to stop thinking that the nice fancy mulch way is the way to go, and you have to kind of embrace the messiness of seeing little twigs that are decaying.
Good advice.
What our next question is, what can I do to prevent drift of the chemicals to my food garden that my neighbors have contracted for with their lawn service, presumably?
Uh,
Can't prevent drift.
there's nothing you can do. Yeah. Particularly if your neighbor is hiring the mosquito fogger, because that's definitely drifting over. What we need to do is stop our misuse and overuse of these pesticides at home. They are not necessary. And that type of regular spraying often creates more problems than it solves. It creates spider mite problems because it's killed all the predators. Um, so it's education. I don't know if you have a good rapport with your neighbor, but if they knew they were spending a lot of money on a harmful process, maybe they would stop. I don't know.
Right.
They're doing it because of peer pressure. They want to be good citizens. They want to take care of their yard. We just have to change what taking care of our yard means.
Here's another related question. My community sprays mineral oil for mosquito control. Does this kill all insects besides mosquitoes? Yikes.
Are they spraying that on bodies of water or on the plants?
Oh, that would be my question.
I bet it's on bodies of water, and that's to smother the mosquito larvae itself. That's an old approach to doing it. It does work somewhat. Um, it's not super for the aquatic environment, but it's not killing everything outside the way a mosquito fogger does. So if I had to choose, I would go with that.
Here's another question. Another thought, how can we organize our communities to combat Phragmites in the roadside habitats and neglected wetlands? And this is a really, really good question, James, because Lake County, Indiana is choked with Phragmites australis. It's in just about every municipality. It's along all of our county roads, that, I-65, which is our biggest highway, 8094 biggest highway. And it is a concern. I do know that the Lake County parks and Lake County maintenance departments are treating it every year, and they are trying different, very, very interesting ways to treat it. And one of those ways is using drones with sprayers on them. And
There, there's a marsh in Ohio. It's called Mentor Marsh. It was the largest Phragmites stand in all of Ohio. It was 800 acres. They have cleaned it up entirely, and it's a thriving freshwater marsh. So if you really wanted approaches that work, I would contact the officials of Mentor Marsh in Ohio and say, how'd you do it? Because we want to do it too.
yeah. It really is a big problem in our county. Our next question is choosing trees to plant for climate change. How do you balance planting host species for fauna with planting for strong carbon sinks? Is there a best ratio? That's a great question.
Yeah. It's one of the things I like about oaks so much is that not only do they support the most species, but they're the best in terms of carbon sequestration. Um, they even supply pollen for pollinators. They've got big root systems to manage the watershed. So they pretty much do it all. But there's a continuum. There's a lot of plants that are valuable that way. You don't want to just have hardwoods for carbon sequestration. Your prairie plants are excellent at carbon sequestration, but they're pumping it into the soil for long-term storage, even though they're not big trees. So, I rather than seeking the very best plants for that, I'm just happy if we get rid of the lawn and put in plants because you're sequestering a whole lot more carbon that way, where the lawn's not sequestering hardly anything at all. It's the worst plant for carbon sequestration. So I appreciate the question, but I don't have a great answer.
I would say probably a good mixture of softwoods and hardwoods along with prairie plants.
Things like tulip
Be
trees
my
grow
advice.
really
Yeah.
fast,
Yeah, things that grow quick.
but they're not going to last very long either. So,
No, that's true. It looks like our last question is, my lawn, due to pure neglect on my part, has become a dandelion monoculture. Neighbors don't like it. Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Dandelions, there are a few generalist pollinators that go to them. A lot of people say, oh, you're really helping the pollinators. There are far better plants for pollinators than dandelions. Um, it's socially unacceptable. People don't like it. Uh, so, is it a good thing or bad thing? It's probably not as helpful for your pollinators as a lot of people think. I'll just leave it at that. But if you were to spray the dandelions and had plain lawn, that's not helpful for the pollinators at all. So white clover would be a much better solution.
Yeah, I would say white clover and then start putting in plugs of things like pussy toes and violets
Yeah,
and
pussy
other
toes.
natives that are low. That would be good. And that will take time, but you can do it. You can do it. Well, thank you, Dr. Tallamy. This was absolutely delightful. I think
You're
we all
welcome.
learned a whole lot. And it looks like the answer to the worm question came up in the chat, and they're Asian jumping worms. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. So thanks for that. Yeah, I had a friend for a long time, a gardener friend. Every single plant that she brought into her yard, she rinsed off the roots and disposed of the soil. And she really reduced her weed pressure in her yard,
That's
along
good.
with not having any, nasty insects. But that really helped for her weed pressure. So if you're, considering it, I might consider it because you don't want Asian jumping worms. They're very, very bad.
Yeah, you do not. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much. Everybody, make sure you go to the Lake County Master Gardeners Association website for more information on our programming. Have a good night.